I am really honored now to have our next guest with us who works for the American Sportfishing Association, and he is none other than Mike Leonard, who is the Conservation Director at the American Sportfishing Association. And this organization has been a true champion for the entire sport fishing community. In fact, earlier this week, folks, I was speaking to the Peninsula Saltwater Sport Fishermen's Association. Great group of anglers there. We talked about what was happening there at the federal level with pieces of legislation, things that we're doing to make sure that there's good fisheries management policy in place, making sure we're taking care of those fisheries, making sure, too, that we are enhancing and preserving the habitat necessary for those fish. And I can tell you that Mike Leonard has been at the forefront of helping in guiding that policy and the discussions that need to happen for those things to take place, and has done a tremendous amount for our recreational fishermen community out there. Mike's also, like myself, a Virginia Tech alumni, and from what I hear, he is a devout Hokies football fan, as I am. So I know that the season is upon us, Mike, and first I want to lead off and ask you, are you going to go to Blacksburg for any football games this year?
Hey, Congressman. Yeah, planning to. With two young kids, don't get to go as often as I'd like, but eyeing a couple of them. The Notre Dame games, pretty attractive, as Miami, they got a pretty good home schedule this year. But it's always great to get back to Blacksburg and see Virginia Tech play, and expecting a pretty good season this year. They'll be pretty young, but a lot of talent, so it should be an exciting season. It
is. I tell you, it's going to be an exciting season, and I know that I really look back fondly on my days in Blacksburg, and believe it or not, have now been able to use what I thought in the classroom, taking all those fisheries science courses, might not ever come to fruition, but it certainly has in all the efforts that we've been undertaking here in the past several months concerning legislation that have a big impact on recreational fishermen. And as you know, recently House Resolution 200 passed, which is the extension or the reauthorization of what's been termed the Magnuson-Stevens Act. It's not the new term for the bill. The new term for this new bill is Strengthening Fishing Communities and Increasing Flexibility in Fisheries Management Act. Boy, what a mouthful, but it's essentially reauthorizing the mainstay of fisheries management, which is the Magnuson-Stevens Act. It authorizes a spending of about $1.6 billion over the fiscal year period from 2018 to 2022, and really starts to solidify how fisheries management takes place across the spectrum, but most specifically what it does for our recreational anglers. And as you know, you and I, as well as many others, have had discussions about, how do we put in place those practical elements of managing our fisheries? And when I say practical elements, I'm talking about what fishermen see each and every day, taking that observational data, making sure that fishermen are a part of helping develop the data to manage this fishery. And as you know, I had a bill in called the Healthy Fisheries Through Better Science Act that became part of the Modern Fish Act. This is kind of, it's almost like the predatory chain. It was like my bill became part of the Modern Fish Act, which became part of the bigger bill. So it was like, I use the analogy, it's like a bigger fish eating a smaller fish that then gets eaten by a bigger fish in turn. So it's amazing to watch that effort. But it really does some pretty innovative things. So, Mike, I wanted to get your perspective on what you think are the most important elements of this piece of legislation that is passed that now becomes the foundation for how fisheries are managed into the future and the resources that are going to go towards managing those fisheries.
Yeah, well, for most anglers, they just want to get out in the water and have the opportunity to catch some fish. So, I always find it interesting working on fisheries policy that the act of fishing itself is, relaxing, enjoyable, just all around great time. The policy behind it, as you know, is just complicated and messy and contentious. And, but we have to have good, sound, common sense fisheries policies and management. And, that helps kind of lay the groundwork for recreational fishermen in Virginia and across the country to be able to get out on the water. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the last decade or so is, you always want to strike that balance of having good, sound, sustainable management measures in place, but also ones that allow reasonable access. And so you always want to find sort of that sweet spot where you're you're not hammering fish stocks too hard, but you want to make sure you're maximizing access. And when you don't have good data, and yet you're still required to make really hard sort of precautionary management decisions, ultimately what we've seen recently is that means fewer opportunities, less access, because we've got to constrain fisheries when we don't have good data. So, really this whole endeavor from your original bill looking at how to improve data to the Modern Fish Act, to a lot of what's in that broader H.R. 200, the big Magnuson bill, it's all about getting that pendulum swung back more towards the middle of having good data, using modern technology. Nowadays just about every angler, certainly the ones I know, have smartphones, or some, especially offshore anglers, have the ability to log their catch. And when anglers are being told that we're going to have to close this fishery down because we don't have good data, and we have to be precautionary. A lot of anglers have never been asked how many fish they've caught. They've never had the opportunity to contribute towards the science that drives those decisions. So that's really a key theme to this whole legislation, is getting data, how many fish are being caught, how many fish are out there, to catch up with the pretty strict, rigid management requirements that not only recreational but commercial fishermen are subject to. And it's a challenge that we in the community and in the industry have been trying to strike, but we think this legislation will really get us going in that right direction of having good, sound management, so ultimately people can just have a good time out on the water. That's really what it's all about.
Well, Mike, I appreciate all that you all are doing in that leadership role. And folks, you're listening to the John Fredericks Show this morning. I'm Rob Wittman, guest hosting for John, and we are joined by Mike Leonard. Mike's the conservation director there at the American Sportfishing Association, and has really been in the forefront of making sure that Congress develops good fisheries policy. And what does that relate to? As he talked about, it relates to making sure there are fish out there for all of us to enjoy, to go catch. And what are we doing to make sure that we're preserving those resources for the future? And Mike, I think that's one of those fundamental responsibilities of government is having a common resource like fish is a responsibility for all of us to make sure that we take care of them, and make sure, too, that not only are the fish there, but make sure that we provide opportunities for everyone to enjoy those fish. And as you know, the previous reauthorization of Magnuson-Stevens did a lot of things to make sure that there was good fisheries management policies on the commercial side, because the commercial side does fill a role. It fills a role, obviously, in the economy and for people to go to the fish market and buy fish. But one of the elements that I think is also important economically is understanding that recreational fishermen also contribute a lot to the economy. The tackle that they purchase, the bait they purchase, the fuel they purchase, all those things are economic drivers. And especially here in Virginia, where we have that great resource, the Chesapeake Bay, those things are extraordinarily important. And what we find is that decisions are made regionally. As you know, the Magnuson-Stevens Act set up regional councils where states and others come together to determine how are fish managed that are in those regions, because there may be a fish that's living in Florida that doesn't live up here in Virginia. So they segment the regions in order to make sure that those fish stocks are managed by the states in conjunction with the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Department of Commerce. And this new strengthening fishing communities and increased flexibility in Fisheries Management Act, wow, that's a continued mouthful, but that bill that recently passed provides those regional fisheries managers with the flexibility to look at how do they manage stocks effectively, and how do they better tailor those management plans to the needs of their regions. And I think that's a really important part of this, is because we've seen before the problems that come in is when there's been a one-size-fits-all management perspective. And what this does is to say, hey, let's look at the details about how a management decision would affect a state like Virginia, or how it would affect recreational fishermen in the state of Virginia, or how it would affect the economy in the state of Virginia. So give us your perspective on how you think this greater flexibility now and greater focus on how regions are more of a part of this management spectrum makes things better for recreational fishermen.
Sure, and you're absolutely right. The framework under Magnuson-Stevens is it's there, where you've got these regional management bodies, the fishery management councils. So in this region, the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council runs from around Cape Point, North Carolina, up through up through New Jersey, New York. And so you've got state representation, you've got fishermen serving on these advisory bodies that are helping to develop the regulations that will determine how many fish can be caught and what regulations ultimately look like to get there. But all of that's still operated under this pretty rigid, overarching federal framework, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, that really, particularly in the last 10 years, it was last reauthorized in 2006, has really kind of tied the hands of the fishery management councils to be able to look at, to your point, commercial versus recreational fishing. Do these two activities need to be managed in the exact same way, recognizing that they both involve taking fish out of the water, but that's about where the similarities end. These are two very fundamentally different activities in a lot of ways, but the regional bodies, Virginia and everyone else serving on these bodies, hasn't had the opportunity to really look at these two activities and figure out, do we manage them differently or not, and what might those alternative management approaches look like. So that's really a key part of this whole legislative effort, certainly that we've been working on, is allowing the councils that ability to look at better ways to maximize fishing opportunities, to still ensure that we have sustainable catch limits, but avoid some of the challenges we've been dealing with, particularly in the recreational fishing community. We've got a prime example here in Virginia and in this region with a really popular fish like cobia, where because we don't have good sound data on that fishery, but because we have to manage it under this pretty rigid federal fisheries system, for the last few years, Virginia anglers haven't had reasonable, legitimate access to that fishery because it's operated under sort of this rigid overall catch limit as prescribed under Magnuson-Stevens. So, that's really what this is all about, is allowing states more flexibility to manage their fisheries off their coast, and allowing regions to look at more innovative alternative management approaches. Because where there are actual resource issues, where fish stocks are in trouble, we've got a system in place to ensure that fisheries are able to rebuild. But again, that pendulum's just swung a little too far, where we're getting out in front of having good sound management based on sound science, and instead we're just sort of being overly precautionary and closing things down, whether there's good logic behind it or not. So really, this is a good common sense evolution of this whole system, and ultimately driven at better opportunities, better economic benefits. As you pointed out, people often think of recreational fishing as just a fun, leisurely way to spend an afternoon out on the water. There is a lot of tremendous amount of economic generated by that activity, from the rods and reels and lures people buy to the hotels they stay in, restaurants they eat at when they go on fishing trips. That all adds up, and for a lot of coastal communities around the Chesapeake Bay and in Virginia Beach, recreational fishing is a huge part of the economy that's often overlooked, and something that we just need to be mindful of as we're thinking of what decisions get made in Washington on how we manage this activity overall.
I agree. Those things are critical, especially as you said, to regions. And I'm glad you brought up cobia, because, cobia has been a specific issue of concern for recreational fishermen, especially in the Mid-Atlantic. We have seen the cobia fishery over the past 10 years just explode, and it has been a tremendous economic impact. It has gotten people to enter into the fishery that otherwise hadn't in the past. And as you know, striped bass had been a big part of the fishery here. It still is, but in different ways. The abundance of those fish in the fall of the year has been different now in different locations, not quite as much in certain areas. So cobia has been a real shot in the arm to fisheries here in the Chesapeake Bay. And a lot of people enjoy cobia fishing, myself included. And there's a lot of attention and concern about what happens with cobia management going forward. As you know, several years ago, the South Atlantic Marine Fisheries Commission identified cobia as being one of those challenged fisheries, and looked at the data that was out there, which was old data and less than complete, and said, here are the things that we believe need to be put in place in order to manage cobia. And a lot of those were draconian measures, and states were looking at literally having to shut down their fisheries, effectively shut down their fisheries, and that would have a big impact. So what states did was to push back and said, no, listen, we don't have enough data to really come to a conclusion about whether this fishery is in a healthy state or not, and we don't want to come in and absolutely devastate what is an important part of the fishing economy in these states. So I think there was a good first step forward and said, let's make sure we gather the data. And the federal government closed federal waters, and then states put in place some more restrictive size limits and bag limits, but not ones that closed the fishery down. They limited the season, and this was just Virginia, but North Carolina and South Carolina did other things. But all of them being reasonably restrictive in how cobia were being harvested. And of course, right now they're undergoing a stock assessment. And folks, the stock assessment is essentially gathering data on how many cobia are out there and what we do going forward. And Mike, I wanted to get your perspective, because cobia is a great example about how now with this new framework we can best manage a fishery and not repeat the mistakes of what happened in the Gulf with Gulf red snapper. And for those folks in this region that don't know, that was a myriad of poor decision-making and not including states and recreational fishermen or their observations, and really creating draconian closures to where essentially you eliminated Gulf red snapper fishing, and that had a tremendous impact on the economy. We want to make sure that that doesn't get repeated here in the Mid-Atlantic. So kind of give us your perspective on how now we are going to be finding ourselves without having to be in arbitrary rebuilding time frames of fish stocks like we have been in the past, and where things were forced into on Gulf red snapper.
Right. Well, yeah, Gulf red snapper, you're exactly right, is sort of the poster child of fisheries management going wrong and exactly where we don't want to go. And it continues to come up as all the issues with Magnus and Stevens that recreational fishermen don't like have all kind of manifested themselves in Gulf red snapper. I will say we've been fortunate, in that fishery under this administration. We've made a lot of progress over the last two fishing seasons, where we've gone from a 3-day federal season to 40+ days, with each of the states having more control over how that fishery is managed. So we're starting to make progress and still have a ways to go. But that was a good example of sort of the creative, collaborative type of management that we think is sorely needed for a lot of fisheries, particularly recreational fisheries. And cobia would be another great example where,
yes,
as you mentioned previously, you had the South Atlantic Council, which Virginia doesn't have any representation on to begin with, dictating sort of region-wide decisions where maybe each state should have more of a say in how fisheries off their coast should be managed and what those regulations might look like. And we're starting to get there with cobia, with each of the states through the Atlantic States Fisheries Commission starting to look at developing a management plan for assuming management of that fishery, where that should give the states a little bit more flexibility in how that fishery is managed, and see where it goes from there.
Yes.
But we're starting to chip away at it. But without some common sense tweaks, changes to the Magnus and Stevens Act, we don't need to overhaul the system, but we do need to look at it and whether sort of the overly prescriptive provisions in there that have fishing access and really sort of defied logic in a lot of places. We just need to give those who are out there on the water, those who care about these fisheries, the states who have a tremendous stake in ensuring these fisheries are well managed and sustainable, that they have more of a voice, more of a role in, from the data collection all the way up to determining, what the regulations are going to look like. So that's really sort of the central theme here, and appreciate all that you all have done, and especially your leadership role in the House and in getting those bills brought to the floor and passed. And we still look to the Senate and hopefully can get some activity done there. But
that's what we want to do.
It's exciting to at least see these issues brought to the forefront and not sort of buried as back page news. That I think certainly political leaders like yourself are recognizing that fisheries in general are really important to the nation and provide a lot of jobs, a lot of economic impact, as well as good overall well-being of people who get to go outside and appreciate nature. So,
yes,
but we ultimately have to have good, sound policies to help allow all that to happen. So, we're starting to chip away at it, and it's been encouraging, but we still have a ways to go.
We do. Mike, I did want to, in the few minutes we have remaining, talk about another bill that's of really, I think, significant importance, and one that you have helped tremendously on in really elevating the attention that's necessary, and that is on fish habitat. You know, we talk about fisheries management all the time, but we're not going to have fish to manage if we don't really do all we can to conserve the habitat. And I recently introduced the National Fish Habitat Conservation Through Partnership Act, and with a lot of good feedback from yourself and others about how we best put that bill together. So I want to get your perspective here in the few minutes we have remaining about that bill and the things that are important about it, and hopefully where we end up with what it will do for our fish habitat.
Sure. Well, as you know better than most that, for good fishing, you have to have good habitat, and ultimately, generally when you're getting out on the water, that's what you look for where you're going to cast your line is, where there's good structure, where fish are going to live and reproduce and thrive, where you have good, healthy habitat. And there's a lot of work going on throughout the country at the state and federal levels to do a lot of good on the ground, whether it's, removing old derelict dams or replanting native vegetation or restoring natural stream channels. A lot of great work that's being done, but not necessarily all in a coordinated fashion that sort of looks at the big picture of, how does this all tie together and ultimately ensure at, the population level or at the regional level, these projects are all adding up to a bigger picture. So, that's really sort of the vision behind this legislation that you've championed. And as you well know, serving on the Migratory Bird Conservation Commission, we've got a great model out there on the wildlife on the waterfowl side through the Joint Ventures program of having these coordinated regional and sort of local driven efforts that are all coordinated and ultimately adding up to a bigger picture. So that's sort of the model of this, is sort of build off of successful programs that we've seen elsewhere, especially on the waterfowl side, and ensure all the fish habitat work that's going on that's driven by local partners, local fishing and conservation groups and states, ultimately sort of serves under this broad umbrella of the National Fish Habitat Conservation Program. So it's a really exciting program, and getting it authorized by Congress and getting some positive administrative changes to it, will go a long way to ensure that we can continue battling those management issues, but ultimately have a good, solid foundation of good, healthy habitat that makes sure that we have sustainable, healthy fish populations out there. So it's a key cornerstone in this whole discussion, and something we really appreciate you getting behind and helping to get it through the House and ultimately get it to where we can make sure this is a successful model going forward to help coordinate all those good, important habitat programs that are going on throughout the country and in Virginia.
Well, Mike, listen, thanks so much for your leadership on this and all that the American Sportfishing Association does to really champion good fisheries management policies, to make sure that our recreational fishing community is engaged in this, and to make sure too that those thoughts and ideas go into formulating legislation like the National Fish Habitat Conservation Through Partnership Act, which, as you said, it really replicates a really good model that's done for migratory waterfowl, like the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, where you can leverage other dollars to get these things done. So, Mike, thanks again. Thanks so much for your leadership, and thanks for all you do in Washington. Thanks for the American Sportfishing Association.